Welcome to week 10 of the Sacred Hour. This week marks an important milestone in your journey through Scripture. You have now completed just over two-thirds of the entire Bible. That is no small accomplishment. Many people begin reading the Bible with sincere intentions, but far fewer remain steady long enough to build the kind of rhythm you have developed over these past weeks. You may not have realized it while you were moving through the chapters, but the book you just finished carries a unique distinction. Jeremiah is actually the longest book in the Bible when measured by the number of words in its original language. Staying with a book of that length requires patience, attention, and discipline, and you did exactly that. By this point in the sacred hour, something different has begun to settle in your reading. The experience is no longer rushed, and it is no longer unfamiliar. A steadiness has formed.
When you give God one uninterrupted hour each day, something begins to change quietly within you. Your attention deepens. Your thoughts begin to slow down. The noise of everything else loses some of its urgency. Many of you are already sensing that God has been meeting you in the text, shaping your awareness and sharpening your attention to His voice. Each week, we pause for a moment to remind ourselves where we are in the Bible and how the portion we are moving through fits into the larger story of Scripture. When we first began this journey together, we talked about how the Bible is organized into major sections and how moving through those sections helps us understand the unfolding story of God's work with His people. Taking a moment to orient ourselves each week helps us see how what we are covering connects to the broader movement of Scripture. This portion of Scripture places us firmly within the major prophets.
These writings belong to the broader prophetic movement within the Bible, where God speaks through chosen messengers to interpret Israel's history, confront covenant unfaithfulness, and reveal His long-range purposes for redemption. The books you encountered this week were written during seasons of national crisis and deep uncertainty. These prophets were not speaking during times of peace and stability. They were speaking when the world around them was collapsing, kingdoms were falling, cities were burning, people were being carried into exile. Yet it is precisely in those moments that the voice of God becomes unmistakably clear. You spent much of the week in the later chapters of Jeremiah. Jeremiah's calling was one of the most difficult assignments given to any prophet. He spoke to a nation that repeatedly refused to listen. Again and again, he warned the people that their covenant unfaithfulness would lead to destruction. Yet even in the middle of warning and sorrow, Jeremiah continued to deliver a message of hope. He spoke of a future day when God would establish a new covenant with His people, one written not on stone tablets but on human hearts. From Jeremiah, you moved into the book of Lamentations. These writings capture the emotional and spiritual aftermath of Jerusalem's destruction. The poems of Lamentations give voice to grief, confusion, and sorrow. Yet even in the middle of devastation, the writers refuse to abandon their confidence in God's character. The book reminds us that grief does not cancel faith. Honest lament can still exist alongside deep trust in the Lord. After Lamentations, you entered the vivid and often unsettling visions of Ezekiel. Ezekiel had been taken into exile and was speaking to a community living far from their homeland. Through powerful visions and symbolic actions, Ezekiel explains why judgment came and what it reveals about God's holiness. At the same time, Ezekiel begins pointing toward a future restoration that depends not on Israel's strength, but on God's initiative. By the end of the week, your reading brought you into the early chapters of Daniel. Daniel shifts the setting from the collapse of Jerusalem to life in exile under foreign rule. Daniel's story shows what faithful living looks like when God's people find themselves surrounded by systems and cultures that do not share their beliefs. Yet Daniel also reveals something larger than the experience of exile. His visions remind us that kings, empires, and political powers all operate within the authority of God. When you step back and look at these books together, a powerful picture begins to emerge. Israel's kingdom has fallen. The people have been scattered. The structures they once trusted have collapsed. Yet God continues to speak. Through prophets who warned, wept, lamented, and endured exile, God interprets the meaning of these events and reveals that his purposes are still unfolding. The major prophets teach us that history is not random, suffering is not meaningless, and exile is not the end of God's story. Judgment comes because covenant matters, holiness matters, faithfulness matters, yet judgment is never the final word. Restoration and renewal remain woven into God's long-range purposes for his people. As you moved through these readings, you also encountered the deeper themes we have been tracing throughout this journey. Scripture unfolds across time with remarkable continuity. God's character remains steady even when circumstances shift dramatically. Human experiences of fear, grief, obedience, and courage continue to echo across generations. This week also speaks directly into our own lives. Jeremiah reminds us that obedience may be costly, yet it is never wasted. Lamentations reminds us that sorrow has a place within faithful worship. Ezekiel reminds us that God's holiness remains present even in exile. Daniel reminds us that faithfulness is possible even when the surrounding world feels unstable or resistant. The prophets show us that God is not absent when systems collapse. He is present, purposeful, and continuing to move his plans forward even when the path leads through disruption and uncertainty. As you continue forward in the sacred hour, the prophetic voices will keep building. In the coming readings, you will finish the major prophets and then move through the minor prophets. Though those books are shorter in length, their message carries enormous weight. Together, they confront persistent sin, call God's people back to covenant faithfulness, warn of coming judgment, and continually point forward to hope beyond exile. These prophetic voices also prepare the way for something greater. After centuries of prophetic silence, the promise that echoes through these writings begins to take visible form. When you move into the Gospels, you will see how the life of Jesus fulfills the long arc of prophecy that stretches across the Old Testament. As you sit with this week's readings, notice how often God speaks most clearly in seasons of upheaval. Through prophets who endured rejection, grief, and exile, God revealed not only his judgment, but also his patience, mercy, and unwavering faithfulness. The prophets remind us that God does not abandon his people when certainty disappears. He meets them there, he speaks there, and he continues to move his purposes forward even when the path leads through waiting or loss. As you close this week of reading, remember this. The same God who spoke through Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel is the God who meets you now. He remains sovereign over nations and attentive to individual hearts. He is faithful in judgment and rich in mercy. And as you continue forward in the sacred hour, he is not only telling his story in Scripture, he is shaping his story in you. Remember, every minute you give to God is forming something within you. Keep reading. Keep listening to God's voice. Allow the word to do its work. Stay sacred to your sacred hour. Now let's continue our time together as we look more closely at what we encountered in this week's readings.